Welcome to Psychedelics Past, Present, Future, a lecture series organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at the University of Winnipeg. We're featuring speakers researching psychedelics, drugs, and consciousness-altering practices. Psychedelics and plant medicines is a topic that has many justice implications, but touches on much else, from philosophy and history, chemistry and ecology, indigenous knowledge and relations. I acknowledge we are situated on ancestral indigenous lands on Treaty 1 territory. I acknowledge these lands are the heartland of the Métis people. As a settler here, I acknowledge that Winnipeg's water comes from Shoal Lake 41st Nation. CAIJ is organizing these talks because the drug war is oppressive and must be ended. Some people find healing in psychedelics during the pandemic too, and surely after, given the research focus on psychedelics, healing, and PTSD right now. Some people want to investigate consciousness, explore the infinite present. Some people are passionate about their sacred relationship with plant teachers and medicines. Our next talks look at endogenous DMT and the pineal gland, drug legalization and policy, and more throughout June and July. Thanks to the University of Winnipeg event team and the media team for all the work on this. Here's the format for today. Our speaker will speak for 30, 35, 40 minutes. The co-hosts will ask some questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. You will see a Q&A or chat tab, and you can enter your questions there. The co-host will relay those to the speaker. Now let me introduce two very important people. First, our co-host, Agnieszka Dahl, is postdoctoral fellow with the Health Law Institute and the Technoscience Research Unit at Dalhousie University. They completed their PhD in law at University of Victoria. Their socio-legal ethnographic research explores practices that organize everyday governance over psychiatrized persons and processes of knowledge production. They teach health law, criminal law, gender and law, research design, and ethics. And today's speaker, Dr. Erika Dyck, is author of Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus. Professor Dyck has studied the treatment of mental illness for the past 15 years in a number of major works, including Managing Madness, the Weyburn Mental Hospital, and the Transformation of Psychiatric Care in Canada, winner of the Canadian Historical Association Prize for Best Book in Prairie History. Professor Dyck has also co-edited Psychedelic Prophets, the letters of Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond on the correspondence between those two notable figures. A Canada Research Chair at the University of Saskatchewan, Professor Dyck believes critical thinking is crucial to reviewing the historical role of psychedelics in our understanding of mental health. Professor Dyck believes the benefits of psychedelics can also transcend mental health into wider social contexts. Professor Dyck has unearthed a lot of empirical material on the unsung influence of women in the history of psychiatry, and also Professor Dyck is involved with the Shakruna organization and movement. Thanks, Professor Dyck. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that very, very generous introduction. I am going to attempt to share my screen. And there. Is that working for everyone? Speaking into the void now, so hopefully it works. Well, I'm really, really pleased to be here, coming to you from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis in Saskatchewan here. And as Kevin mentioned, I've been working on this topic for almost 20 years now. So I'm really excited to share some of the story with you, some of which is old in that I've been working on it for a long time, but as the story changes, as the conversation changes around psychedelics in the last few years, the history has also become, we've started to tell different historical narratives, and I want to touch on that just a little bit. If my screen will advance. Right. So when I began studying this project in the early 2000s, I was a PhD student at McMaster University, and even some of my committee members were kind of, chuckling and laughing and suggesting that I was really interested in the history of LSD because I wanted to study these hippies and sort of black market underground activities, music cultures. And although those things are very interesting, that was not what I was particularly interested in. When I went to the library, what I found were that the books that had been written about the history of an earlier period of psychedelics tended to focus on and emphasize some of the more conspiratorial aspects or some of the unethical components of LSD and psychedelic research more broadly. And so there are books like Acid Dreams that was published in the 1980s. There's also another one called Storming Heaven, also published in the 1980s, which sees upon this story about a kind of drug and psychoactive experiences that were brought into medicine, but quickly leaked into a culture and sort of infused as a countercultural set of activities. So anti-war protests, a variety of different kinds of protests, some of which are related to different civil rights activism. And this is the kind of boom bust narrative of, this drug that comes into medicine, but even within those medical circles in the earlier literature, the medical experiments were described often as unethical, as funded by the CIA as part of mind control experiments, as something that was kind of nefarious and part of a Cold War context, and then moves into a social space or a cultural space where people are taking these drugs recreationally, and certainly where they're taking them in abusive contexts. But I really wanted to know what was behind some of those stories. And this image from the Toronto Star Weekly from 1961, I think captures this kind of wonder that I had. As you can tell, this is from a microfilm reel, so it's from, old days of research. But here we've got, Russia puts the first man into space. We've got this sort of reminder that we're still anchored in the Cold War and a space race. And on the same front page, LSD, miracle drug or menace. And I was fixated on this idea of trying to understand how researchers at the time, how decision makers and thinkers at the time could invest in the idea of LSD as a miracle drug prior to it becoming sort of tipping over into the menace category. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, is some of the enthusiasm that drove the early generation of psychedelic research in the late 1940s through the 1950s, and what lessons we might take from that as we think about the so-called Renaissance today. So LSD, I'm going to focus on LSD for now, although there are other drugs that I'll bring in a moment that were part of this earlier generation of research. LSD was first synthesized in 1938 by Albert Hofmann at the Swiss pharmaceutical laboratories called Sandoz. But it wasn't until April 1943 that he had the first experience. The first time, a vial of D-lysergic acid, diethylmide 25, spilled onto his hand, and he had the first recorded LSD experience. The next day, he wanted to try this again more purposefully. And this is what has launched the sort of famous stories and his own memorializing of his first LSD experience, which for some of you may know or have heard of, the bicycle day. This was the day that Albert Hofmann took LSD and then went on his bicycle and rode home. And as he got on his bicycle, he felt that he'd been launched into a Salvador Dali painting. He could feel his limbs, but they didn't seem connected to him. The roads yawned and rippled, he described, as he moved into this kaleidoscopic display where he couldn't tell reality from fiction. And he was gripped in these perceptual distortions or visual hallucinations that caused him to wonder and caused him to reflect on what this psychoactive experience was doing to his brain, but also what it was doing to his sense of reality and his sense of perception. And after a few hours, the experience kind of mellowed out, wore off, and he reflected on this deeply. And you can still see in his writings, he continued to write about this for a long time. And I think the next image actually, sorry, I forgot that I had this image in here as well. There's a graphic novel being written about the historical experiments, and they depict some of his experiences. And here he is on his bicycle. He encounters his neighbor. He thought she was a witch at this time. He looked at his hands and felt that they had grown out of proportion. These kinds of perceptual disturbances were really animating his experience. But it also, as a biochemist interested in these chemicals, not as a clinical scientist, so he wasn't supposed to be doing human research. He was really interested in what these might do to teach us about brain chemistry and to teach us about potential therapies. So Sandoz took a rather unusual move and made this drug, LSD, available to researchers around the world to begin doing experiments, and people could apply through medical licenses to gain access to LSD. On his 100th birthday, Albert Hofmann was feted, and this was one piece of the tribute art. So this is a man who had many, many, many LSD experiences, among other things. And if anyone's worried about the sort of long-term damage, he also reflected on this throughout his life. And he describes it as this sort of problem child. He's both fascinated by this drug, but he's also kind of troubled by what it might come to represent. And he kind of walked that line throughout his life. But many people have sort of seen him as the godfather of psychedelics. Now, as a historian, my job is to contextualize some of these discoveries or these moments, and I want to paint that picture a little bit with a quote here from Stanislav Grof, who became a psychedelic researcher himself and is sort of the father of holotropic breathwork for anyone who follows that. Grof says that Dr. Hofmann's discovery of LSD generated a powerful wave of interest in brain chemistry, and together with the development of tranquilizers, was directly responsible for what has been called the golden age of psychopharmacology. Now, this is coming from a fellow psychedelic researcher, but it's true, and others, historians and psychopharmacologists alike, have recognized that the 1950s were a transformative period within the history of psychiatry and the history of pharmacology for introducing a whole new generation, even a paradigm of thinking about psychopharmacology and pharmacology more broadly as one of the sort of first steps towards treatment, particularly within the field of mental health. And we see in this period thousands of advertisements now flooding into medical journals, and certainly hundreds of new pharmaceutical products being available on the marketplace for psychiatric conditions, depression, anxiety, psychosis. And so in some respects, the development of, or the focused research on LSD in this period fits within a broader context of scientific research, biomedical research, shifting gears and focusing on these pharmaceutical outcomes. And in that respect, LSD is not particularly unique. But the way that LSD works and the way that psychedelics work changes that. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail. So again, from this graphic novel, which is called Wonder Drug, by the way, I've got a note to it at the end. What happened to bring these to the Canadian Prairies? For many of you may know that in 1944, Saskatchewan elected the first socialist government in North America. There were some municipal ones before that, but the first sort of provincial level or state level socialist government. And as part of that election promise, the government, or the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, led by Tommy Douglas, had campaigned on a promise to reform healthcare. And the chief piece of that reform was to introduce universal healthcare, or publicly funded healthcare. But to invest in a publicly funded healthcare system, they needed researchers, they needed physicians, they needed psychiatrists to get on board with some of these healthcare reforms. And this is where some of the psychedelic research sort of flourished. In 1951, psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond got on a plane and brought his family from London, England to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, maybe roughly where that map or that flag for the CCF is marked on the X there, and brought them to what was then one of the largest old style asylums in Western Canada. This is the Saskatchewan Provincial Mental Hospital at Weyburn, a clunky name, so I will call it the Weyburn Hospital for brevity. Humphrey Osmond joined this sort of spirit of healthcare reforms that was unfolding in the province, and he was very interested in psychiatric reforms. He, like many other psychiatrists at the time, felt that there were limited options for psychiatrists available to psychiatrists working in these large-scale institutions, that these institutions had become what sociologist Andrew Scull calls the sort of dustbins or the detritus of society. People went in, but they were very rarely released from these institutions, and very few people were rehabilitated. Osmond was joined by a number of other researchers, and this is just sort of one quick example of Abram Hoffer, who was very closely related to Humphrey Osmond. Abe Hoffer was an agricultural chemist who then trained as a physician and did a specialty training in psychiatry, and he worked at the University of Saskatchewan. So by today's standards on Zoom, that's not very far away, of course, but this is a decent car ride. So they tended to write letters back and forth to each other frequently, which is why we have all these wonderful texts to work with. Abe Hoffer was really connected to a variety of other people, and I just want to briefly mention them to just give a sense of the kind of network of people that were working locally and why I think some of this research was able to sort of become institutionalized in the province. Abe Hoffer's sister, Fanny Kahan, pictured on the left, was a journalist. She worked for the Winnipeg Free Press, and she also wrote a number of books and stories, including a manuscript that was never published until 2016, long after her death, called A Culture's Catalyst, which is an account of the Native Church of America's peyote ceremonies in Saskatchewan. I'll talk about that in a moment. Her husband was Irwin Kahan, pictured on the right. And this is a biography, Tending the Tree of Life, that he wrote in his 90s. He was the director of the Canadian Mental Health Association. So even within this one family, there's this interesting network of people who are communicators, people who are tied into mental health reforms in the province. And when you start to do that across a few of the other psychiatrists, you begin to see this space in which community activism and community investments in mental health reforms really took shape and were able to spread quickly through the province. This is an image from 1953 when Maclean's magazine sent its reporter, Sidney Katz, who's pictured in red there, sent him to Saskatchewan to participate in witnessing the kinds of research that were taking place in the province involving these drugs that caused hallucinations. So hallucinogens is the word most typically used at this time. Katz took a dose of LSD and sort of introduced to English-speaking readers across Canada in a 12-page story about the wonders of LSD. And this introduces readers not only to LSD, but to some of the research that's taking place in this province. And there are a lot of eyes on the province at that time for that synergy between the health reforms and the kind of research that was being done to support it. And to give you just some quick overviews of the kind of work that was being done, Sidney Katz describes his experiences, and there was an artist hired to capture these as well. So these are from the graphic novel, but in the Maclean's magazine, you also see different artistic renditions of what Katz is describing with his words at the time, and it's words that he actually used to describe it the day afterwards. He felt things like his senses were disorganized, or they traded places. So he could, hear with his hand, or he was hearing with his eyes, something that other observers had also remarked upon. And what they found was that Katz began to describe something that the researchers were driving at, which was that by taking psychedelics, you could have an experience that sounded like, that felt like, that allowed people to appreciate what it was like to have psychosis. And this led them to this idea that LSD, or psychedelics more broadly, caused a model psychosis. So this wasn't a treatment per se. They weren't using psychedelics to treat anyone in this vein, but they were using it to encourage psychiatric nurses, social workers, physicians, and allegedly a few cabinet ministers to take LSD to better empathize and appreciate the plight of patients who had difficulty organizing their speech or who could not communicate in words alone, whose perceptions were disorganized, had traded places. This model psychosis was really important as a training idea, as a model for thinking about how we begin to reform mental health care if you can appreciate what it's like to be in the patient's shoes, particularly for patients with psychotic disorders for whom many believed there were no cures, there were no genuine rehabilitation efforts or genuine treatments. There are excerpts throughout the Maclean's magazine describing Katz's experience. I won't read these in detail, but I'll just give you just a brief I'll read the first one here. He says, "He'll never be able to describe fully what happened to me during my excursion into madness." And that concept of being, a voyage into madness is very much prefaced by this idea that they are creating a model psychosis. He says, "There are no words in the English language designed to convey the sensations I felt or the visions, illusions, hallucinations, colors, patterns, and dimensions which my disordered mind revealed." And that's sort of played upon in some of the graphic images that come out of this period as well. And he goes on in some of the description, it's 12 pages. So some of the description gets a little bit frightening. He talks about the kind of frenzied feelings that he has, but he also has very peaceful and quiet reflections. And that kind of trajectory that unfolded over about 8 hours, he says is 12 hours as a madman, he's including an integration period there. That long period of reflection is something that also attracted researchers like Humphrey Osmond and Abe Hoffer to imagine how that might be applied in a therapeutic setting. This kind of research also attracted other people, though, outside of the psychiatric community. And one very famous encounter was with Aldous Huxley, who had heard about the research that was taking place in Saskatchewan and wrote letters. And of course, Humphrey Osmond was quite obliging. He put some mescaline in his pocket and drove to Los Angeles to introduce Aldous Huxley to mescaline. And it was not a month later that Aldous Huxley wrote the first draft of The Doors of Perception. He was so inspired by this experience. And that experience also helped to forge a relationship that lasted for the next 10 years before Aldous Huxley died, where he and Osmond wrote letters, and Kevin mentioned this. This is a book that we've published of their correspondence, which is really quite they're letters, they're candid, but it's a really beautiful story about a relationship between these two men as they are trying to make sense of what these psychoactive experiences mean, what they might mean in terms of bringing spiritual components into a healing setting, what they might mean in terms of borrowing ideas from indigenous ceremonial settings that were brought into a more westernized, secularized clinical setting, and what they might mean for sort of rethinking the way we understand therapeutic relationships, particularly in a psychiatric encounter. I don't expect you to read these words, but I'm a history nerd and I can't help it when we found the original, these are scanned copies, of course, the original moment when these two men come up with the word psychedelic. So I will just draw your attention to the little handwritten scribbles at the bottom of the typed page. And here Aldous Huxley is playing around with these ideas. He says phanerothym and phanerothymic, and he's trying to come up with a word. As Kat said, there are no words in the English language designed to convey those sensations. Here they are trying to come up with the word. And you can tell there's a little bit of difference in their handwriting. Humphrey Osmond sort of scribbles on the bottom of the page. He says, to plumb the depths or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And the next day he writes it again, this time to fathom hell or go angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And over the next few pages, or letters rather, they sort of play around with these ideas about, what do these words convey? They wanted to avoid something that sounded overly medicalized, and they wanted something that was, as Osmond puts it, free of contamination from other orthodox ways of thinking about consciousness or about psychiatry. And I love that this word continues to animate the conversations today because I think it still conveys some of those open associations. I promised Kevin I wouldn't talk for too long, so I'm going to quickly move on to their studies on alcoholism, which really coincide with the model psychosis. It happens almost at the same time. But one of the ideas was that if this model psychosis could be used to train people to empathize with psychotic symptoms, when we think about the applications to therapy, addictions research and alcoholism in particular became the prime target. One of the ideas was that as people hit rock bottom, and sometimes that is accompanied by having hallucinations and delusions, this is the time that people on an alcoholic trajectory are most likely to seek help. It is also a time that can sometimes be very dangerous physiologically for damage to livers and nervous systems and whatnot. So the argument that they had was, what if you could help people get a glimpse of that rock bottom before their bodies start to fail? What if you can simulate rock bottom through this idea of a model psychosis? And researchers in other jurisdictions, including E.M. Jelinek at Yale, were fiercely supporting and advocating for a medicalization of alcoholism. So something that wrestles this syndrome or this problem drinking, there's different words applied to it at the time, takes those behaviors out of the space of going to church groups or 12-step therapy groups and moves it into a clinical space. And psychedelics were kind of a bridge there. But even though psychedelics may have aided in some of the medicalization components, members of the 12-step program, the Alcoholics Anonymous, including co-founder Bill W., were also quite intrigued by the way that psychedelics might help people first simulate rock bottom, but also achieve insights of a spiritual nature. And this is one of the versions of step 2. I know it has changed in different iterations of the big book, but here in the original 1955 version, for our group purposes, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Bill W. confided quietly in a letter to Humphrey Osmond that it was very difficult sometimes. This was the most difficult stage for people joining the 12-step program to achieve. And they had some back and forth conversation about whether this was, that it was difficult to get one's ego out of the way in order to accept the help that they needed or wanted, or whether there was a kind of frustration with the spiritual element that's woven into this step. But regardless of the reasons why people had trouble with this step, what they found, and Bill W. did this himself to check, was that by taking a dose of LSD or a dose of mescaline, or in some cases psilocybin, people could have a spiritual experience. They could get beyond themselves. They could see outside of themselves, not as a cure, but as a way to then join a 12-step program, to join Alcoholics Anonymous, so that they could get the therapy that they needed. And it was a trigger or a piece of the step that would help. Now, Bill W. was very concerned about disclosing this information because it would demonstrate that he was no longer abstinent. So he quietly supported these steps by channeling people through to Alcoholics Anonymous. And some jurisdictions, including in Manitoba, there was a research group in Brandon, another one in Winnipeg, also in North Dakota, and in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan branch that came out of Regina, all openly advertised for Alcoholics Anonymous to work jointly with the psychedelic research centers. So you could see that kind of regional discrepancy there. This is an image from Sydney Katz because of permission to use all of these pictures, of course, but hundreds of clients went through these training facilities, or sorry, these research facilities in legal clinical trials. Many of the people who came through under the alcoholism category described these spiritual experiences. This is one that's being described by a nurse who's talking about, or writing down rather, what the patient is saying. He had a momentary oneness with God. He had a vision while lying down with eyes closed of a spiral staircase with himself talking to another person. This appeared to have great meaning to him. These kinds of moments were described sometimes as breakthroughs or as epiphanies or as insights, and they were so over time, researchers were very intent on trying to cultivate a kind of experience that would allow for that kind of insight to take place in the moment. To that end, they were very aware that it was not simply the drug itself, and psychedelic researchers seized upon this in the past, and certainly this is part of the conversation today, but the development of set and setting, or attuning the environment to a safe and comfortable and perhaps even a provocative space to help bring about these kinds of insights. So not strapped to a bed in a clinical ward in a psych hospital, but freely moving around in a room, perhaps with dimmed lighting, often with music, usually classical music, or I should say always with classical music in these cases, often with living plants, even if they were fresh cut flowers, but having some reminder of nature, and always having therapists present. In the Saskatchewan and Manitoba setting, those therapists had to have had their own psychedelic experience in order to qualify to be part of the experience. I'm going to zoom ahead. Music therapists were really important, and if anybody's interested, there are a few new articles that have just been posted on chacruna.net. One is about the music therapist by musicologist Steve Lett, and Zoe Debus, who's a graduate student at the University of Paris, is writing about some of the ways in which women were participating in kind of theorizing that set and setting. So it's not enough to say, you need a couch with this kind of texture on it, but really thinking about what it means to create appropriate settings that allow people to feel comfortable. People felt anxious when they were told they were going to get a psychedelic, but also to allow them to relax into the experience so that they could achieve those epiphanies or insights that were so coveted. The results of this kind of research were astounding by contemporary standards as well as by today's standards. There were reports that suggested that they were receiving about 30 to 90% recovery. That is, after people joined 12-step programs, in most cases, most people joined Alcoholics Anonymous. It was also how they could track these patients or subjects by this time. And after 2 years of follow-up studies, they were put into the, that's when the assessments were done. And based on those numbers, these are absolutely astounding results. Now, there are some tricky, we need to be critical of these numbers a little bit, in that they got really good at recruiting people who would do well through these studies. But I wanted to just point this out and talk about it more later. Part of it is about also the attention to that spiritual component. And if anybody's interested, you can read more from Michael Lyons, who's written a master's thesis on this topic. So still in the 1950s and even beginning in the 1960s, there's a lot of enthusiasm for this kind of research. Not only does it start to match up with healthcare reforms that offer what look to be a cost-effective way of treating addiction in ways that allow people to return to their families, return to paid employment or resume paid employment or get new paid employment. Alcoholics Anonymous is happy, temperance reformers are happy, and even many theologians are quite happy because it also brings elements of spirituality back. And in fact, one of the leading advocates for psychedelic research in Manitoba was Pastor Podoroka, William Podoroka, who was a Presbyterian minister who very much advocated for the use of psychedelics because he really felt that bringing those spiritual components was advantageous for a world that he thought was secularizing too quickly. And of course, these spiritual dimensions also owed a lot to an understanding of a much longer legacy of using psychoactive substances in healing and spiritual ceremonial settings. In 1956, a number of the researchers in Regina and Saskatoon attended a Native American church ceremony, a Peyote Ceremony, which was held just outside of North Battleford. It was hosted by the Red Pheasant group and also with Native American church members from Montana, from North Dakota. And it was fairly staged. The Star Phoenix had reporters there. Everybody, I'm sure, was on their best behavior. But nonetheless, even in a staged opportunity, it was an opportunity for researchers to learn more about these Indigenous ceremonies up front, and also for some of the people involved, particularly those in Saskatchewan and Alberta, the members who joined at that time, to express to the federal government that peyote was part of a cultural rite. Peyote is the cactus of which mescaline was synthesized from. In this very publicly acknowledged ceremony, you can see Humphrey Osmond there in the background. He is the only, he's described as the white scientist in the newspaper later. So he's the only white scientist who participates fully in this experience, but he is so moved by the ways in which the ceremony helped people to understand how you prepare, how you let go, and how you integrate the insights from those experiences. And he wanted to bring this back into the research, but he also was moved to advocate to the federal government that this was a necessary healing spiritual ritual that must be protected. The federal government did not listen, but nonetheless, it was part of what inspired some of the research that they were doing. So how does this all come apart? In 1962 was a pivotal year for a variety of reasons. First, well, not first, but one of the reasons was that thalidomide was introduced in 1961 in West Germany, and by 1962, many jurisdictions had pulled it off its shelves. American Food and Drug Administration did not regulate this for American users, but they did get supplies from Canadians. In Canada, thalidomide was available, and there were over 100 children born with teratogenic birth defects in Canada as a result of thalidomide use. This scandalized scandalized the world as these, images of deformed children splashed through newspapers. There was a kind of wake-up call. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are all of these pharmaceuticals that are flooding Canadian markets, North American markets, world markets, and the idea that these drugs have not been tested sufficiently to reduce the risks really shocked people. At this time, the Canadian government created a new schedule, Schedule H, on which they put thalidomide, and at the same time, they added LSD to that list. They were the only two drugs on Schedule H. The Canadian Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychological Association, and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons banded together to resist this move, suggesting that Parliament should not be messing around with determinations of risk and efficacy. That should be the domain of the physicians and the psychiatrists and psychologists who are working with these materials, not to politicians. You can see Pierre Burton there occasioning a meeting that was televised where Abe Hoffer sort of debates with University of Toronto students. In this case, though, Abe Hoffer said on live television that LSD is safer than aspirin. Also in 1962, TimothyLeary sort of catapults into the global stage, but certainly into a media frenzy, where he moves from being a Harvard-based psychologist to becoming a media darling and a psychedelic guru. He famously recommends that we all turn on, tune in, and drop out, and he loses his job at Harvard. Reports vary as to whether that was to do with his mescaline experience, or sorry, psilocybin mushroom experiments with prisoners, or whether he had just stopped showing up for class. I'm inclined to agree with the latter. But he loses his credentials, but he nonetheless sort of becomes this countercultural figure who suggests that we should not be confining these to medical domains, but in fact, everyone should have access to these. And in fact, it will change the world. It will end the Cold War. And he makes all sorts of fantastic predictions. Also in 1962, Sandoz removes its legal supplies of LSD from circulation. It tightens its controls on the access to legitimate or bona fide medical researchers because they recognize that there is a black market of acid, of blotter acid, of things that are causing people to hallucinate but are not Sandoz approved. Sandoz is concerned about its reputation and they would remove their supplies. And we know that a number of things are happening here in terms of the news media, but also there are a number of protests and the sort of rising of the counterculture that gets associated with psychedelic use, rightly or wrongly. I'm going over some of this quickly because I want to get to the last bit, which I want to talk about the sort of future of psychedelics. There are a number of commissions in the United States, in Canada. John Diefenbaker gets upset that there are, these debates are just simply titillating people and causing people to want to take LSD, causing people to want to take psychedelics rather than emphasizing the harms. And as the media really picks up, and I tracked this in my research where I was finding, 5 or 6 or 7 articles, say in the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star a year, to having 600 plus articles about psychedelics as we move through the 1960s, and that the tone and the volume of coverage changes dramatically throughout this period. And it moves into a period of real division. So LSD and psychedelics are no longer considered medically viable or medically beneficial, and they move towards drugs that are considered harmful and subject to abuse. By 1968, the sort of final nail is in the coffin in terms of the Canadian scene, when this time the Senate introduces the next motion, and it is championed by Senator Molson of the Brewing Company, that recommends that these drugs no longer have medical use and that there is not sufficient medical information or scientific research to demonstrate their use. And the story sort of ends there to some degree in terms of the above ground conversation. Of course, there's a whole history now of what's been going on in an underground of psychedelics, but that's for another day. But it sort of remains dormant, and some of the research changes and focuses on animal-based research, but research with human participants with psychedelics goes underground or ceases until, at least in 2007, David Nutt, who was then an advisor to the British Food and Drug Administration, published an article in The Lancet arguing that we had it all wrong, that our assessment of harms and risks has been organized around assumptions about abuse of drugs, where in fact, if we think about it in the context of long-term healthcare concerns, tobacco and alcohol should be at the top of the list, and drugs like LSD and psilocybin and MDMA should be amongst the least harmful. And this rocks the world in some respect. He loses his job, although he landed on his feet at Imperial College and is now director of a psychedelic research center. But he suggests that we need to rethink the way we assign harm. Now, David Nutt is certainly not alone. A number of researchers are now either coming out of the shadows or turning their attention to psychedelics and resurrecting some of these ideas about the benefits. Stephen Ross, here in the image for High Hopes, is a New York physician who works in palliative care. He has been arguing and now publishing clinical trials on end-of-life anxiety and the role of MDMA and psilocybin. Ben Sessa in England is the one who coined the term Psychedelic Renaissance and is also a clinician who has been working diligently on resurrecting these ideas about psychedelics in safe therapeutic context. And the number of conferences and publications is growing exponentially. Kevin and I were chatting about this just before we started. Here's just a couple of examples. Psychedelic Science, Rick Doblin, of course, who is a champion of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Breaking Convention in the UK. These are just a few examples. Michael Pollan's best-selling book, How to Change Your Mind, has introduced millions of readers to this history, but also his own. He goes through 4 different drug experiences that he has as he creates this very personal and very polished and perhaps even sanitized account of why we should trust psychedelics. And there are new research centers opening. In 2019, Johns Hopkins received a huge donation, an independent donation to set up a center for psychedelic research. It was already involved in psychedelic research, but now a dedicated research center. A year later, Berkeley has launched its own Center for Psychedelic Science and Education. And Canada is participating in these conversations, not yet by investing in a psychedelic research center per se, but Canada today is having a parliamentary review on the medical assistance in dying bill. And as part of that, they have opened their lobby to the Canadian Psychedelic Association. I was there this morning speaking to senators. My colleagues are speaking to Health Canada right now as I speak about the place that psychedelics have within the future of dying care and within the future of Health Canada. The story is, yet to be completed here on that front, but it is worth noting that the first legal psilocybin patient in Canada in the 21st century is Thomas Hartle, who's a 52-year-old father of 2. He lives 10 minutes from me in Saskatoon, and I love the kind of historical symmetry of psychedelics returning to Saskatchewan, where the word was first coined. Thomas has stage 4 cancer. He's had that diagnosis since 2016. He has had 2 psilocybin experiences through Section 56, a healthcare exemption that allows for the use of this substance in this particular setting. He's one of 12 patients in Canada who've had this treatment so far, although there are hundreds now on an exemption list who are seeking exemptions for end-of-life anxiety. This, as I said, this story will have a different ending depending on which day I get to speak again. But this is a scene that is to be watched, I think, as psychedelics not only represent changing healthcare options, but I think also represent a different kind of intellectual project about how we manage pain, how we think about trauma, and where we want to invest in our healthcare outcomes when it comes to thinking about how we manage mental health and mental health crises in our communities. And thank you again. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm sorry for talking so long, and I hope that you have questions. These are the some thank you and some acknowledgements to the images that I was using today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your remarks and for doing this research and for being so pivotal in this renaissance or movement as it proceeds. So now we're going to have some questions. If anyone in the audience wants to put a question down into the Q&A there, Agnieszka and I will see it and we'll be able to relay it to Professor Dyck. And I think we'll just start out with some questions of our own, if that's okay. So first question I had was, could you say a little bit more about why Saskatchewan was the site where a lot of this unfolded? Like, was there a health minister? Was there some other government insider who was really onto this?
Yeah, I'm looking and looking, and I promise that I will let you know if I find Tommy Douglas's LSD trip. Um, I haven't found that to be the case. Douglas was certainly very instrumental. And when he was first elected as premier in 1944, he also acted as health minister. And I think it was in part a symbolic move to demonstrate how keen he was to transform health. And that was the sort of key objective. Of course, they were involved in a variety of different policy reforms, but he's central to that. He's also got connections with different medical establishments around the world, mostly in Britain though. And so it was he who was instrumental in attracting doctors from other places, people like Humphrey Osmond, who began to do that research. I don't see that he as health minister and he as premier, I don't see that he had anything specific about psychedelics, but he definitely was open and encouraging of thinking outside of the kind of conventional boxes. Long-term care is not working. And Douglas had worked as an intern in the Weyburn Hospital. He had a really keen familiarity with psychiatric care, and he was very passionate about transforming psychiatric care. Again, I don't think that extended to psychedelics, but I think he was very passionate about these areas and was allowing a variety of different kind of research projects to flourish under his guidance, if that helps.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask another question before I turn it over to Agnieszka. You mentioned, the original plan was to have healthcare providers and other people have psychedelic experiences so they would be more empathetic. How concrete were the plans? Have you come across any records where they said, we're going to give them this dose, we're going to...
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about the history of psychiatry, or the history of psychotherapy, psychoanalysts, who there were many more psychoanalysts, there's still some today, but psychoanalytical methods were much more popular. And the idea behind psychoanalysis is that you have to go through analysis yourself in order to provide that therapy. So in that sense, it's also, again, kind of not as bizarre as we might think of today. Today, if we go to your doctor, maybe not with the COVID shot, but, we don't assume that our physicians have tried all the medications that they are prescribing. But I think that is more of a legacy of how dramatically we've shifted towards pharmaceutical products in the past 75 years. As we think about, a 1940s or 1950s context, not all physicians, but psychiatrists, it was not unusual for them to have tried to experience something that they would then recommend to their patients. That's one piece of it. We do have protocols, and there are a variety of different protocols that were in place, both not as much around dosing. They were trying to determine dosing, but it was a bit all over the place. But really thinking about things we might think of today as harm reduction efforts. Those aren't the words they use, but how do we manage, how do we make sure, how long should we watch someone for? How long would this experience go for? And even after, there seems to be no sort of biochemical effects, how do we monitor people? How do we make sure that they stay in touch? Because the integration period can also be really sensitive and people can be quite fragile. So all of those things were really helpful to try with nurses and physicians, and often in couples. So doctors would try it and they'd bring their wives and they would talk to their wives about it, and wives would help them integrate and make sense of those experiences, even though they weren't being paid, even though they weren't medically trained. But it was having a trusted person to help sort of think, what does this mean? What is this experience doing? And how can I translate that into something meaningful?
It also reminded me of some claims of Graham Hancock when he says, all politicians should have multiple DMT trips before they're, governing our lives. There's a link there.
I mean, there could be a whole master's project on the claims of the claims that people have had about if only we got this in the water supply, if only Khrushchev could have had this during, the Cold War, there's these sorts of claims about how you could dose people with LSD or other psychedelics to try to calm them down. Now, I will say that I think all of the researchers in the environment that I was looking at least, definitely warded against giving people psychedelics without their knowledge. they very readily recognized, and I think partly from their own experiences, that was a game changer. That was never going to be something that we should engage in. And in fact, there have been trials where, there were legal inquiries about trials where that had been the case, and those came out sort of uniformly looking unethical. So maybe not in the water supplies.
Agnieszka?
Thank you. So I was wondering, because you were talking about that Hoffman was really interested in going and learning more about the spiritual aspects. So I was wondering if this was a general approach of scientists involved in psychedelic studies and clinical trials, or maybe there were kind of like different approaches and some people resisted or some people tried to mitigate and incorporate to some extent. If you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and one that I'm reflecting on more than when I first started doing this. I was sort of blind. It was sort of a blind spot for me, and I'm realizing, and maybe it's because the conversation today is changing and is getting me to look back at this more. I do think that spiritual component, it pops up in different ways, and people use different language to describe it, but it also lends itself to a very different sort of interdisciplinary moment in this history. So they're working closely with ethnobotanists and to some extent linguists, and particularly as they look sort of south, certainly south from here, but as researchers are trying to appreciate some of the indigenous ceremonies, but even just the plant, there's also a very sort of capitalist and imperialist component to this, of like finding plants that you can synthesize into medicines. And that required linguists and botanists and anthropologists working together. So there is some of that. I think some of it is utilitarian, like, can we find a cactus that we can sell? And some of it is a little bit more sensitive to those cultural components and how that, so different researchers maybe would calibrate that differently. But the anthropologists are really critical in this period, particularly as they start searching for other psychoactive substances that fall within this hallucinogen category. And they kind of stumble into these long histories of using different plants for different kinds of healing mechanisms that have a spiritual component to it. Even if it's not described in that way, even if it's described using an indigenous worldview that doesn't parse out spirituality from something else. So I think some were more attuned to listening to the more sort of comprehensive ways of describing that than others. Others are a little more specific. Mm-hmm. There's people like Stanislav Grof, who I just briefly mentioned there, but he comes from Czechoslovakia in 1968, during Prague Spring. He's escaping essentially. And he also has, he goes on to develop all sorts of other ideas about this, about the way that you have to experience death in order to appreciate a kind of flooding of spiritual information so that you can really live. And he does this through inspiring and working with midwives, as well as people who later go on to describe themselves as death doulas, and these transformative moments for him. So it's not the same way that people talk about spirituality, like seeing God, but he talks about these spiritual transformations almost through traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
As an example.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A about historical matters, and then there's one more future looking. Would it be okay if I turn to the Q&A questions for a second?
Sure.
Okay. So there's a question from Professor Kelly Gorkoff. The disease model tends to dominate responses to mental health as it did with alcoholism, but programs like AA are arguably most focused on spiritual life and spiritual health and well-being. It doesn't always fit with the disease medical model. There's this tension there. So how does the uptake of psychedelics disrupt the disease model or reinforce it?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I think if I just sort of keep it in the historical lane for now, instead of thinking about it today, I think that was something that these researchers were wrestling with was, does this, is this a bridge to the medical model, or is it a bridge away from the medical model and I think that tension, animated some of the ways that they tried to understand the research and I don't want to celebrate these guys too much, but it's hard not to also, you read hundreds or thousands of letters, like, oh, okay, I kind of trust these guys now. But I do think that they had a very sincere approach to thinking about ceremony and what ceremony does, for healing, which is inseparable in some ways from thinking about spirituality and healing at the same time. And what they felt was that the medical model did not allow for a kind of ceremony or a kind of deference or a conscious way of thinking about our interactions with pharmaceuticals, as opposed to a transactional approach. And I think that was the piece of the medicalization that they were quite resistant to, that, going and getting whatever it might be over the counter. And it's not that they were anti other forms of pharmaceuticals. Again, I got my vaccine, this is not an anti-vax sort of position. It's not anti-medicine, but I think what the medical model represented was something that maybe moved too far, I think they would argue, away, moving some of these things away. And they would like to see some of the back, when they really articulated this in the context of dying care, that in a setting, this is before the word palliative was coined, but dying care models really needed that spiritual component, that you had to shift gears. You had to think differently about providing, again, I'll say, like, dying with dignity, not the words that they would have used, that's more today's language, but a good death, a death that allows for reconciliation and a harmonizing of feelings in a spiritual and a physical way. And that's where you see the greatest, I think, the way that they start to interact with that medical model. And today, I think, the conversation's a little bit different in that the medical model is sort of the thing we know, as opposed to the thing that was still in process in this 1950s moment. And so I think it's more about kind of resurrecting or pulling the pendulum back a little bit to acknowledge these kind of overlapping components where spiritual components might actually or should actually be part of that healing and well-being model as well.
I'll take one more question from the Q&A and then go back to Agnieszka. Here's a question from Professor Adina Balin. Thanks for your interesting talk. Could you speak a bit more about the correspondence between Huxley and Osmond? How long did it last? What other topics did they explore?
I love talking about their correspondence, so thanks for that. It's just it's a beautiful story of a friendship, really, that comes through in these letters. They met in 1953 and they corresponded frequently. They met each other periodically, but they wrote a lot of letters. They didn't talk on the phone that much. So we have letters that go for about it's a little over 700 pages of letters. And it goes right until Huxley's death in 1963. He died the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And he died while his wife Laura, his wife Laura, the day before he died, he had an LSD injection. And this was part of what he felt was part of that spiritual salve to, as he describes, release him from the mortal bonds of living. And so through that period, and then Osmond retained contact with their son and with some of his family members afterwards. Their friendship, they're 20 years apart, but they grew up in the same place in England. They had some things in common. They both felt like they had, left England and become sort of black sheep of their families in some respects. So they bonded over those things, but they were fascinated in the intersections of philosophy and literature and science and psychiatry and consciousness studies. And to that end, their letters are just filled with really beautiful and articulate passages about, like, how do we think about this in the context of a secularizing world? Or how do we think about the power of psychedelics to change the way we, embrace capitalism? And they kind of riff on a variety of topics, some of which are very fanciful. They met Aldous Huxley met L. Ron Hubbard one day, and he writes to Humphrey Osmond, and I was like really excited. The father of Scientology, what's he going to say about this? I really hope it's bad. It was, and he's like, that guy is like full of himself, So there's these colorful moments that are very candid, and then they wax eloquent about the state of the world and consciousness revolutions. So they're really peppered with these beautiful moments that kind of anchor you in the humanity that these two men express. But they're quite, I guess, fluidly articulate in a variety of different disciplines interdisciplinary ways of thinking, and they're very curious souls. So they met a psychic woman, and they were like, she is fascinating, you know, we should do LSD with her. Like, this is just incredible. Like, the way that she accesses information and thinks about consciousness is completely different from our worldview. And, you know, their enthusiasm is so infectious. And I think there's 7 of us who worked on those letters. Firstly, typing them out, they were written in shorthand script, and then trying to annotate them, because there's just floods of people. Like, people go and visit Huxley all the time, and they're like, oh, you know, Gerald Hurd was over for dinner last night. And we're like, oh, you know. So just trying to annotate it, just try to get a sense of this incredible network that they belong to, and how that continually sort of nourished their conversations is, sorry, I get really excited about this. They're beautiful.
So maybe I just follow up on the question a bit of. Maybe you have gained anything from this letter about how the research was funded, like how were there like any donor, sponsor? And I'm asking about the funding of research in the mid 50s and 60s, because today it seems that there's a specific model of funding, and it's more and more become commercialized. So I would like to get your approach, what was going on, and like how do you see what's going on right now in terms of commercialization of research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the historical situation, I think, at least in Saskatchewan, was quite different. And I say Saskatchewan because they did have core funding from the government. And I don't know, I mean, there are other research units that have core funding. I know the Addictions Research Foundation in Toronto had some core funding, but there are also bits and pieces of research grants. They did apply for funding. It's kind of a funny story. They applied for funding from places like the Macy Foundation, which we know is a piece of the CIA, and they were rejected. You know, it's just, I think, kind of funny, because the earlier research is like all of this was CIA funded and it's about mind control. That's not to say that they didn't probably have little pockets of funding from other places, but the sorry, I'm forgetting the acronym, but it's the Saskatchewan Psychiatric Branch provided core funding, and their positions were funded with core money. So that allowed some latitude. And I think that allowed for the flourishing and the sustainability of the research, more so than in some of the research units where they didn't have that kind of infrastructure in place. I don't know the situation for some of the other places, and I think there are some participants even in this call who could probably answer that to a greater degree in terms of what was happening at Spring Grove Hospital, for example, what was happening at the LA Veterans Hospital, where there were also research units. I don't know how many of the researchers had full core funding, or what percentage they were allowed to do research. Osmond was the superintendent of the hospital, but he had a tremendous amount of time devoted to research and was encouraged to do that. Abe Hoffer was completely dedicated to research. His practice was 1 day a week, and that happened over some time. So they did have a lot of time to focus on this and some sustainable ways of doing it. And I think the conversation today has moved a lot. I mean, not only because the state of academic research and scientific research has changed, but also because I think that kind of coming on the heels of cannabis reforms, there's a recognition of the commercial opportunities, and I would say the commercial risks of commercializing psychedelic research, or psychedelic treatment centers in a way that would move these into a different space. And I'm worried about that, quite honestly. I do think that there are investment opportunities, and we've seen some of this is happening already, but I do think it moves it into another domain. I think it moves it outside of the domain of sort of medicine or health for all, and it starts to ask different questions about elite treatment centers that might provide a more tailored, a more sort of, elite and inaccessible treatment.
Thank you.
I was going to ask a couple of questions. One, going to chapter 4 of Psychedelic Psychiatry. Can you say a little bit more about Canadian government regulation of Indigenous relationships with plant teachers and plant medicines?
I can try. It's interesting, 1961, the federal government makes changes to the Indian Act. And if we imagine the kind of the time frame that we're looking at, there are these sort of competing narratives taking place. So the relationship between the federal government and First Nations, the relationship between the federal government and treaty obligations around cultural rights, is changing at the same time that the interest and research in psychedelics is gaining some momentum. And I think there is a little bit of a clash there. One of the challenges is that peyote, which was, considered a sacrament within, that's the word that's used, a sacrament within the Native American church, does not grow in Canada. So it gets tangled up in debates about whether it's legal to import peyote rather than, so the federal government kind of sidesteps the issue of whether it's okay to worship peyote. And instead they decide they don't want to touch the question of Indigenous rights. I'm talking about RITES. So instead they make it illegal to import peyote. And so there are ways that there's a kind of hot button or, hot potato being thrown to different jurisdictions to avoid, I think, looking like this is it is going against the Indian Act. And yet the results are the same. So that's a piece of it. It's interesting to see also that there are other plant medicines, but I'm learning, I'm slow at learning this, but I'm slowly trying to learn and to appreciate the way that ethnobotanists in Canada have worked with Indigenous communities. And some of that information, people don't want to share that. There are too many stories of plants being overharvested, of ecosystems being devastated by, stories that, or information about medicines that get publicized. And so I think there is an understandable sort of a recognition that some of that information is not published, it's not circulating, and that may be appropriate. And so I think, Canada has a lot to do in terms of reconciliation, and part of it is perhaps to begin to think about some of these plant medicines and how this fits into a broader landscape of Indigenous settler relations and the whole colonial enterprise that has changed the way we are comfortable talking about and thinking about plant medicines or plant spirits even.
Wanted to ask a follow-up question too. I've been trying to get into the work of anthropologist Bia Labate's work from Chacruna. Mm-hmm. And recently they made some really important and decolonizing comments on set and setting, this idea of set and setting, and positioning this in a broader cultural, social group meaning about our relationship to the world and to plants and to other organisms, rather than reducing it to like being in a safe space. Can you say a little bit about how you've situated your work in relation to this movement, this decolonizing movement within psychedelics?
That's a huge question. I feel like I'm still learning, and I'm really fortunate to have been working with Bia for a few years now, and I learned so much from her and from the incredible, just vast and incredible network of people that she works with. One of the things that I've really come to appreciate, I hope more than beyond a kind of superficial sense, is the depth of knowledge that people working in Brazil have been really thinking about this in fundamentally different ways. The assaults on the Amazon, the election of Bolsonaro, I mean, talking about these things in the psychedelic context, or at the Sacred Plants of America's meeting, which was a few weeks ago, the damage that is being done to the rainforest beyond what it does to psychedelics, completely changes our conversations about set and setting, and has to refocus energy on simply, staving off the kind of ecological destruction that is happening in a very dramatic way. And I think there's a real sense of desperation and legitimate desperation about what's happening to plant knowledge, what's happening to communities, what's happening to the lungs of the earth, and that has to be they're putting it out on posters, and they're kind of making that a loud initiative, and appropriately so. I think I think some of the energy that's coming from the people who are working in South America is beginning to make its way into the conversations northward. And some of that is linguistic differences, but we also have very disciplinary, we sometimes get hung up on these disciplinary differences as well. And B is, I think, an amazing champion for trying to break down some of those differences, for working with translators, for bringing Indigenous knowledge keepers into the conversations, to creating safe space for having those open conversations. I'm not really answering your question about my own set and setting, but I'm trying to, I guess what I'm trying to say is we have a lot to learn from other people in other parts of the world. And the relationship between plants and people and place is really dear and really vital to this whole conversation. And I think, looking beyond our borders is going to help us to think differently about our own spaces as well.
Thank you. Dr. Agnieszka Dole, do you have additional questions?
I do. Yeah, I was just reading an article today, and it was about like dismissal of contribution of indigenous knowledges to the psychedelic movement generally, but also in clinical trials, and lack of incorporation and benefiting them from the trials. But this article was also pointing out, and I remember that at some point you also mentioned in one of your talks that you're running the project about women and psychedelics.
Oh yeah.
So this was also a recognition that, of course, in different aspects, that some voices of women pioneers are dismissed and not recognized their contribution to psychedelic science. So I wonder if you could elaborate about that, about your project as well.
Sure. Yeah, that was a project that actually Bia Labache had asked me to do. She said, can you write a few things about this? And I said, well, I can put 1,000 words together, but really, like, we need to put this out there and find out what other people think and start, stimulate a conversation. And it's been amazing. At first we're like, maybe we'll get like 10 posts. And I think we're now hoping to get 50 posts. And, I think, tomorrow we'll publish our 40th, I think, or 39th, or somewhere in there. It's been a really interesting experiment, if you will, of sort of testing those waters, but also hearing about how people want to think about gender and think about difference and think about marginality and think about, I guess, voices that haven't necessarily had the front stage. And so it's our window into this was thinking about women in the history of psychedelics, but it's really sort of grown into imagining, what things are we paying attention to and what things are we missing by not paying attention to. When we started on this, it was like, what about all those nurses that sat there and like cleaned up barf sometimes, or like made sure that the water carafe was filled, and also were like paying attention to hundreds of experiences and commenting on that, but are not on published papers, and they're not named in the studies, but they're writing down the notes. They're doing a lot of work. And what I found in reading, so in some of the trials, many of the trials, the patient or subject, some of them were volunteer subjects, not there for a diagnosed reason, they would write about their experience the next day or maybe 2 days later. And so many times they're like, oh, when nurse so-and-so, held my hand, she saved my life. I needed to be grounded at that moment. And there are these moments where the people are reflecting on the importance of people being in the room with them for a tactile experience, but also like, oh my gosh, that organ music, it reminded me of church, which reminded me of this horrible experience I had, and I couldn't express that I needed it to be turned off, and I think I was vibrating, and she recognized it and she changed the music and it brought me peace. Things like that, where these were important interventions. It wasn't just, filling a water carafe. For patients, it was really meaningful. And we wanted to sort of use that spirit, that idea as a kind of kernel of entry into thinking about, okay, well, what other things are we missing here? What other influences were profound? And do we have to read sort of around the experience to appreciate, how do we bring those voices or those components back into the story so that we don't forget, like, I don't think the story of psychedelics is like, once we get them decriminalized, everything will be great. And that's, everything will be fine. I mean, this is going to require a whole lot of thinking about what's important, and is what's important having the setting set up or established, I should say, in a way that actually promotes harm reduction and efficacy, and what does it mean to do that? So really thinking, I know that's a long-winded way of putting it, but the response from people has been amazing, and I'm so pleased to see a number of graduate students and early career researchers who are asking these questions and are already asking these questions, and we're just really pleased that we can showcase that, because people are starting to really draw attention to this in more diverse ways, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, and it kind of coincides with the indigenous knowledges and women healers, and right, so it kind of brings together two different kind of groups that were dismissed. Their voices were dismissed in a way.
Completely. If I may just say one more thing on, we've been working with a number of women Indigenous healers to try to bring their stories out, and it is a long process, and there's a lot of work to be done there before people are comfortable just sort of revealing a story that has sometimes been very harmful and has sometimes caused pain. And I'm really proud of the work that people are doing, and much of it is behind the scenes, and hopefully one day it will be shareable, but it has to be done on the terms of the people who hold those stories, and that's something that we're trying to work really hard to respect that process, but also to be mindful of it. And yeah, stay posted.
There's a comment in the Q&A. What is one thing, or maybe more than one, that we as a society, that people in government should be careful about moving forward so that history doesn't repeat itself? And I guess maybe they're referring to criminalization, maybe they're referring to oppression, violence from the state, erasing of indigenous knowledges, but what should we do so that history doesn't repeat itself in this space?
That's a great question. I wish I had a clear answer. This is the one thing. I don't know. I mean, I do worry that some of the energy focused on psychedelics these days seems to be focused on decriminalization, and I worry that some of the other elements will be missed along the way, or deprioritized, like an opportunity to reconcile some of the gulf that separates Indigenous ways of healing from Western ways of healing, if you will. I think there are a variety of opportunities to think about diversity and access issues in a meaningful way, that just pushing it across a legal line is not going to accomplish all of the difficult work of figuring out, what does it mean to decriminalize? And I don't even mean like decriminalize and it's sold at the same place where, we can get cannabis these days. It may be decriminalized in a medical space. I'm not trying to make a prediction here, but I do think that I'm almost worried that we may be moving too quickly. And that may sound strange in a way, because, it's been a long time that they've been criminalized, and wouldn't it be great if we could open up this conversation? I agree. But I also think we have to do some deep work in thinking about the implications. People are going to take psychedelics if they want to take psychedelics, just like anything. And how do we begin a process of a kind of deep learning? How do we talk to medical students? How do we train nursing students? How do we talk to police officers? How do we talk to kids? How do we begin to talk to teachers? What kind of public education do we want around harm reduction in psychedelics? And I'm not sure we're there yet. I don't think we're there yet, actually. And I don't want to say to put the brakes on, but I do think we need all hands on deck. This cannot be, a triumph of science. This has to be something that has investment from a wide variety of voices and disciplines and ways of knowing if this is going to succeed. Otherwise, someone will have a flashback and it'll all be over.
Agnieszka, do you have other questions that you want to ask?
No, I think I have exhausted all my questions. Thank you very much for answering and this extensive answers.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing all of your research and all of your wisdom with us. And yeah, it was a really great time. And I just want to say, everyone who wants to check out Professor Dyck's work more, go and get this book, Psychedelic Psychiatry. University of Manitoba Press, go to the Chacrooner website and check out all of those posts and all of the knowledge there. There's lots of ways to get connected.
If you want the student version, I say this to my own students. I mean, the graphic novel, which is coming out in November, is like the easier way to read the book. You can it's told through visual images. I think the artists and the writers have done a fabulous job, and it's a wonderful story about the history of psychedelics in Canada. It'll be out in November.
Okay, well, yeah.
I don't get any money for it, I promise.
Thank you again for taking the time away from actually talking to lawmakers today and policymakers. It was amazing that you could be here, and I learned a lot. And yeah, thank you so much
for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And please, people feel free to reach out if you have questions as well.
Thank you very much.
Everybody take care. Everybody stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.